Good afternoon, and welcome to our 2019 Leading with Evidence webinar series. Today's webinar is Engaging Tribal Mothers with Tradition, Family First Act Opportunities for Culturally Relevant Prevention. I'm Suzanne Barnard, the Director of the Evidence-Based Practice Group at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and I will serve as your moderator for today's presentation. The Annie E. Casey Foundation, in partnership with the William T. Grant Foundation, is in our fourth year of co-sponsoring the Leading with Evidence series of convenings and webinars. Our overarching aim has been and still is to offer practitioners ideas that they can immediately apply to their programs and practices, and to help researchers gain more clarity on how to strengthen the utility of their work. Ultimately, it is our hope that all participants support the acceleration of the use of evidence, including research, to improve outcomes for the populations they intend to impact. Our speakers for this presentation today are Marissa Begay, who is the Program Manager for Family Spirit in Chinle, Arizona; Emily Harrose with the Department of International Health, Center for American Indian Health, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health; and Jack Trope, Senior Director of the Indian Child Welfare Program at Casey Family Programs. Their presentation today will introduce us to the Family Spirit program. This evidence-based and culturally unique home visiting intervention for Native American families provides a significant opportunity to understand and meet the needs of Native American parents of young children while addressing the state Title IV-E prevention program requirements of Family First. I want to take a moment to go over some important housekeeping details for the webinar. After we hear from our presenters, we will have some time for questions. We will need to keep our attendees on mute, however, throughout the webinar. We ask that you submit your questions by entering them in the Q&A window, which you see circled at the lower right-hand corner of your webinar screen. You can submit a question there to the panelists. If you are in full screen mode and want to ask a question, you may need to return to the event window by using the drop-down controls at the top of your screen. I will also mention that this presentation is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be available later at aecf.org. And now, I'd like to turn things over to our first presenter, Marissa Begay. Welcome, Marissa.
In Navajo, that means hello and thank you. And then greetings to everybody else on the webinar. Again, my name is Marissa Begay, and just by way of introduction, in my culture, and I just introduced myself in saying that I am of the Mini-Goats clan, born for the Water People clan, Saltwater People clan. My maternal grandfather is of the Towering House people, and my paternal grandfathers are of the Honeycomb Rock people. So I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation here in the Chinle, Arizona office, as Kate mentioned, for the Johns Hopkins Center for American Indian Health program. And I serve as, again, the program manager for logistics for Family Spirit, alongside colleagues kind of throughout the country, and I'll be presenting with one of them today. And so perhaps, by way of introducing myself and where I come from, that's just the norm for us. When we make connections with anybody that we come across, especially other natives and other members of, a team, we identify who we are, paying homage to of course, our mom, our grandma, our grandparents. And so with that, I hope I have some relations on today's webinar, and if so, I greet you and welcome you again. So today I'm actually going to talk about the Family Spirit program, so thank you for turning to the next slide. Let's take a look at the topics of the presentation today. Again, I'll be presenting with my colleague. We're looking at the intro of Family Spirit, which I'll go ahead and talk about, and then just briefly touch on the scale-up of Family Spirit, as well as hand it over to my colleague, Emily, to talk about new directions with the partnership with the Casey Foundation. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we look at the sacredness of children, and when we come across this question of how we can make impacts, and so many tribal communities believe that children are sacred. Even down to a baby's first laugh in the Navajo culture, for instance, a baby's first laugh is a cause for a formal celebration. So whoever provokes that milestone wins the privilege of hosting a first laugh ceremony. They have to throw a feast in celebration of that because it's the infant's first arrival, and it's the marker of them entering the earthly world. So there's some teachings around, before baby's first laugh, they're still connected to the spirit world. And then, to extend from that, children, because children are so sacred, and because we see the need to work with children, we also see that ceremonies are done in many tribal communities, and they vary, of course, among different ones. There's even ceremonies for when adolescent children become men and become a man or become a woman. And so the becoming of age is another big milestone for children before they become adults. Okay, and next slide, please. So where to begin? Here are some statistics to help us paint the picture of a rather large health disparity. And of course, a lot of these, the magnitude and the intensity of some of these issues differs among different tribal communities based on region. There's drug use, some specific drug use in certain communities, while there are others in different regions. So we see that, more than 46% of American Indian women become pregnant at a very young age. We also see that because of exposure to drug and alcohol in really early ages of their life, we see a high use of these substances because of that. And then just talking about just the rural and isolated, highly mobile regions, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I wanted to just kind of focus, and on this slide it's just listed as one bullet point, but this very big issue of historical and cultural loss, how it amplifies all these risk factors for drug use and negative parenting. So we look at that, and because it's tied to trauma, when a community's world is destroyed and they're placed in, concentration camps or reservations, not only does that generation suffer from severe trauma, but it's also passed down from generation to generation. And oftentimes it is called intergenerational trauma. American Indians or Native American communities, we suffer a double dose of these trauma, first from just that historical trauma caused over 500 years of colonization, plus, the second layer of that is children growing up suffering from multiple adverse childhood experiences. And then just because of this breakdown, the family traditions are interrupted or disrupted. Okay, so we'll go ahead and turn to the next slide. And this just short phrase of, stronger parents raise stronger children, we see that poor and negative parenting, is very much so referred to as poor maternal self-efficacy, or even inconsistent discipline, coercive parenting. They're all used interchangeably. They all associate with externalization and internalization behaviors in infants and toddlerhood. And because of that, they are also predictive of problems for these children when they enter middle and later childhood years. For that reason, early life is the most, and we know that early life is the most formative development period. Therefore, parenting, it just makes sense. It all lines up on why parenting and pregnancy is the key time for behavioral redirection. We see a lot of evidence-based interventions that prove this, and we see a lot of outcomes positive effects that can be made up to the age of 19. So it just all makes sense that, we want to raise strong children, and that means we have to work with the parents that are raising them. Okay, thank you. So what is one solution? So we're going to take a look at one solution, and we like to call it an Indigenous solution. Family Spirit is the largest and only evidence-based and culturally tailored home visiting model designed specifically for Native American families. The Family Spirit curriculum covers a wide range of topics related to maternal care, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit, but the intervention is designed, again, to be delivered in Native American communities. Therefore, we have a strong emphasis of working with paraprofessionals. So it's designed to be delivered by paraprofessionals at the minimum, and that I believe in the next slide I'll talk about that and why it's a core strategy to working with these families in their community. It's a curriculum that ranges from, prenatal care, as early as 28 weeks gestation, all the way to when the child turns 3. With the Family Spirit program, parents gain knowledge and skills to help achieve, optimum development for their children across the physical, cognitive, social, emotional, language learning, and in just self-help. It consists, again, of 63 lessons that can be taught from over 3 years range. And then with the family involvement piece, we do emphasize that, because it is home-based, which very simply does mean going into the home and teaching families in their home settings, but it also just means, and it can extend to, meeting where the families, where they're at, whether that be, sometimes there may be some situations where families are very mobile, and so they don't really have a home, but they can meet where they can come to the office. Oftentimes we're meeting them in the project vehicles, at a local library, just wherever it works for the family and where they feel comfortable receiving this education. And because, again, you're meeting them where they're at, we encourage family involvement heavily. So fathers and grandmothers and sisters are strongly encouraged to attend the sessions as well. Okay. So then we also, just going back to just a list of things. So the topics in our curriculum just range from, breastfeeding to, talking about STIs and prevention of those, nutrition, drug use, family planning, just to give you guys an idea of what's all in that 63, that box of 63 lessons. It also wanted to just highlight that it also helps eliminate language disparities because you are employing, and going to this slide here, employing the paraprofessionals as family health educators locally. Being able, there's just a lot of, it's so rich to pull from your own people, your own community, and have them, most of the times it's either young moms that are coming in and working with other young moms, or it could be grandmas that have been, in the community for generations and are coming back and teaching their young moms again. It just makes sense. So reservations, as you guys know or may not know, a lot of reservations have a big shortage of nurses, and so to utilize those type of professionals is very problematic and challenging. So the local paraprofessionals is where Family Spirit was designed to be delivered by them to help navigate not only the cultural itself, the cultural assets. A lot of families want to learn about their teachings. Somewhere along the way they've been lost, and these home educators can help them share that information, and vice versa. It's just a nice, rich sharing of cultural teachings that's prompted throughout the curriculum. And then we also know that it also helps build trust between the families. So we talk a lot about that, and we work largely with CHR programs as well, and they are a big component of delivering Family Spirit in their communities, wearing many hats. And so Family Spirit is also strengths-based. We focus a lot on shortcomings most of the time, but Family Spirit is very strengths-based in that way. Moving on to the next slide. Okay. So just wanted to highlight just the development of Family Spirit over the past few decades. It took a lot of patience. So as you can see, the curriculum ranged from from prenatal to 6 months postpartum, then to 12 months postpartum, and finally we in our third control trial we did expand it to 3 years. So just to give you guys a glimpse of what that process looked like, and just in where we are currently. Okay. Next slide, please. And from those 3 randomized control trials that we just saw on that graph there, we see that they demonstrated the trials demonstrated the impact in several domains: the parenting, mother's outcomes, and child outcomes. And I won't go one by one through these outcomes, but as you can see, this is where the rubber meets the road. And these findings predict that children will have a lower risk of substance use and behavioral health problems over their entire life. So we talked about how the externalization and internalization are all associated with poor parenting or coercive parenting. The program boosted knowledge of participating mothers and their beliefs to believe in herself, or that what we call self-efficacy. And then we just saw a big decrease in the mother's depression and substance use. And so these are just it's a glimpse at what the randomized controlled trials showed us. Okay, and then to the next slide. Here's a closer look at the children's outcomes, and this is how children were ultimately impacted. So the line there, the green line, is the national norms, and you can see the difference between the children that participated in the Family Spirit program and children that did not participate in the program. You can see the difference in the number of aggression and impulsivity, anxiety and depression, and just being fussy, disordered. So those are all examples of those domains there. Okay, next slide, please. So then I'm just going to talk very briefly about the scale-up of Family Spirit, and if we look into the next slide, we see the map here. So currently we're in the replication of the model, and currently we're in over 125 communities across 20 states. We're also implemented in 3 non-tribal communities. Those are listed. They're highlighted here in yellow or orange. Sorry, in orange. And so everyone else is considered a tribal affiliate. So we have affiliates from the Blackfeet Nation to Oglala Sioux Tribe in South Dakota to a lot of California tribes with the northern and southern California. In Oklahoma, we have it, and in Kickapoo, Texas. Of course, Arizona, we have them in a lot of the Pueblo communities, and then even in the Northwest region with Yellow Hawk. And, Tulalip is one of the tribes that we're also working with. So just to give you an idea of, the tribes that we are working with and helping them disseminate this information to their community members. Okay, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Emily Rose, to speak on new directions. Emily?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Marissa, and thank you to Annie Casey Foundation and all of you for joining. So as Marissa mentioned, I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the new work we're doing in partnership with Annie Casey Foundation and a little bit about how we hope Family Spirit might fit in with the Family First Prevention Services Act. So as Marissa showed in that timeline slide, Johns Hopkins has been working with tribal communities in the Southwest over 2 decades to really develop and test Family Spirit. And test it through 3 randomized control trials. And we, with our new work with Annie Casey Foundation, we're kind of building on that and continuing to work in partnership with tribal communities in the Southwest, as well as some of these national replication sites that Marissa mentioned as well. And we're working on really how to enhance implementation, efficiency, and scalability of Family Spirit. So from our experience over the years of working on Family Spirit, we know that not everyone will need the same prevention interventions or approaches. So for some, it might be healthy eating or help with safe parenting or referral to get medical treatment. And we really need to be sensitive to these diverse needs and designing different approaches and designing different programs. So this has been sort of the area we've been focused on recently with our partnership with Annie E. Casey Foundation. Next slide. So what we've learned kind of over the past two and a half years of working on this project is that most home visitors tailor content, right? They kind of, especially the really good home visitors, they know what a family needs and when. But it can be challenging to make sure the program is responsive to like the wide array of needs and then changing needs that are ongoing. So, you know, a mom may present one way in one situation and then present another way, you know, in a week or two, have other issues that might need to be addressed. So what we've sort of sought to do is to create this almost like puzzle pieces program where we're working to identify like what are the active ingredients or the core curriculum that every single family should get and would benefit from. But then are there these other curriculum parts or other components that we could add or take away depending on sort of the need of the family. So we've been identifying active ingredients and working on optimal dosage of those components, and then creating decision algorithms really to guide home visitors, so guiding all of the home visitors in what to deliver and when to really help better meet the family's needs and feel like the family's getting sort of more precision, more tailored care. Next slide. And so just briefly, we've worked over the last year, a year and a half to develop those critical ingredients and decision algorithms. And we're now testing this in a small pilot site in partnership with the Intertribal Council of Michigan, several of their sites, to conduct a pilot study of this process, comparing this, what we're calling precision approach to standard family spirit. And our main outcomes are not really so much the sort of client level outcomes as much, although we want to monitor those and make sure those are, we're still achieving the same client outcomes, but really we're looking also at like acceptability, feasibility, engagement, retention, and then maternal and child outcomes compared to family spirit as usual. So that's some of our current work, and as we simultaneously explore ways to enhance family spirit through this implementation science, we're working to continue to disseminate and support communities and using family spirit to help families they work with. So with that, so Jack, the next speaker, will go into this way more, but briefly, you know, the Family First Prevention Services Act provides a new opportunity for tribes to receive Title 40 funding for prevention services. States can use Title 40 funds for prevention and intervention services and programs for up to 12 months. And services funded under the law must be evidence-based mental health prevention and treatment services, substance abuse prevention and treatment services, or, most relevant to family spirit, in-home parent skills-based programs. Next slide. So while Family First is not currently on this list, which I think Jack will go into more depth, but Family Spirit does work within child welfare systems. So many families that Family Spirit programs work with are involved in child welfare systems. Child Protective Services often make referrals of families to Family Spirit to address parenting concerns and efforts to retain custody. Family Spirit has trained and supported social workers in implementing it, making it a flexible model to be delivered by the main workforce of child welfare systems. We have heard from some sites that suggest that culturally appropriate interventions are favored by families and evidence-based programs are favored by child welfare judges, making sort of this combination of a very culturally informed program that's evidence-based, kind of an optimal program for these situations. And we also have some inquiries from Native social service organizations, but have lacked funding to really implement it. So thinking these are prime opportunities to really apply some of that funding to. Next slide. So as we sort of said, Family Spirit and why it fits into this type of funding, it's the only tribally designed and tested evidence-based home visiting program recognized by Home V, which is the Home V review, which is the big national review that was just completed on home visiting evidence of effectiveness. There's evidence from 3 RCTs to support its use in addressing maternal stress, depression, and behavior problems, while also promoting children's earliest social, emotional, and behavioral development. And as I mentioned, it's not yet on the Family First Clearinghouse, but we are working on it and need advocacy to be considered in the next round of reviews. However, Family First, this funding can still be used by tribal welfare systems to implement Family Spirit, even though we're not currently on the clearinghouse. We just would like to be on the clearinghouse. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and pass it on to Jack. If you have any questions, concerns, feel free to email either Marissa or myself or the national office. And here's some other resources in case you're more interested in finding out more about Family Spirit. And Jack, I'll pass it on to you now.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I'm with Casey Family Programs, not to be confused with Annie E. Casey Foundation, although we share a similar parentage way back when. At Casey, we work with child welfare systems to reduce the need for foster care. We build communities of hope, and we work with all 50 states, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and tribal nations across the country. The unit I'm with, we focus on working with tribes and also on things like Indian Child Welfare Act compliance in state systems. So that's just by way of a little background. So in Family First, as was already mentioned, the main focus of Family First is evidence-based programming. And as was already mentioned, there's a clearinghouse that's working to develop approved programs that have where the evidence has documented their effectiveness, so that those programs can be used in general under Family First and be eligible for 4E funding. But there are specific tribal provisions in Family First that create a little bit of a different system, at least for some of the tribes. And so that's what I want to talk about this afternoon or this morning, as the case may be, with all of you. So 4E, as many of you may know or may not know, tribes can access Title 4E in 2 ways. They can access 4E directly from the federal government by submitting for approval the same sorts of plans that states have to get approved with some minor variations, or they can access 4E through a tribal state agreement. So those are 2 different situations in terms of accessing some of this Family First money. So I'm going to cover both of those in my presentation. So specifically in Family First, there are provisions that recognize the right of tribes who are running a 4E program to include prevention services as part of their plan. HHS is directed to specify separate requirements and performance measures for tribal programs, at least for those that are direct funded. And most significantly, I think, HHS is directed in the legislation to allow programs and services adapted to the culture and context of the tribal community served. And it's not always that laws passed that are of general application remember to include provisions like this. So I think it's very significant that this was included in Family First. So as indicated in the next slide, so the question is, how is this going to be implemented? And so far, HHS has issued guidance for direct funded tribes, and that's a relatively small number at this point. There are about 17 tribes approved and several more going through the process. But for those particular tribes, the requirements are not as stringent as they are for states in terms of evidence-based programming. The guidance indicates that the tribes are not bound by the evidence-based program requirements, and that they can qualify programs under a separate set of appropriate tribal criteria. And so some examples that they give in the guidance are the longevity of the practice, teachings on which the practice is based, values and principles that are incorporated into the practice, whether the community or elders in the community, leaders in the community approve or sanction the process, And then there needs to be some mechanism for community feedback and evaluation of the practice. Again, this is still fairly general. It's going to have to get fleshed out further during the implementation process. But you can see that there's additional flexibility provided to direct funded tribes to provide programming that's really community-based and culturally based in terms of these prevention services. Now, they are bound by the categories. It still has to be in those broad categories that Emily mentioned. But within those categories, there's more flexibility in terms of these cultural programs. And so some of the guidance also talks about different evaluation and study designs, such as community-based participatory research. Some of you may have heard of a practice-based evidence model, and that's which is a community-based way of evaluating the effectiveness of programming. They talk about qualified clinician is not defined, so in some cases you may have more traditional healers or other traditional people involved in the programming. And trauma-informed includes unique tribal historical trauma, and I think you've already heard some about that earlier, so I won't go into that in any detail. But you can see, again, an effort to reflect the realities of tribal communities. Next slide, please. So in addition to the unique cultures of various tribes across the country, the other reason why these special provisions were deemed necessary is because there are a lot of challenges in building evidence for culturally based practices. Now, family spirit is in some ways an exception to that because it's been replicated in so many communities and is at this point has a large sample size to develop evidence based upon that sample size. But when we're talking about a program that might be specific to a tribal community based on its own cultural practices, or maybe a small group of tribes that are similar culturally, you have very small sample sizes. It's difficult to identify comparison groups. Sometimes there are ethical issues around conducting evidence-based evaluations or studies, and sometimes the methodologies that would be required don't fit with the cultural values of a given community. Now, again, this isn't always true, but it can often be true, and so it can narrow the number of programs that might get through a rather strict evidence-based regimen. Next slide, please. So again, in thinking about how tribes might use this, there are a number of different components to that. In some cases, tribes may take programs developed elsewhere and just tweak them to incorporate cultural concerns. In some places, they may develop them totally internally. I know tribes, just an example, that use equine therapy, and they have cultures that were historically horse-based to a significant extent, and that's developed within the community and within its own cultural norms. Perhaps a program like that would qualify, or canoe journeys in some of the tribes along the northwest coast. So again, as I mentioned before, there could be different ways to document effectiveness. The practice-based evidence model, which I mentioned, it emphasizes local community knowledge. And good example of an alternative process that already exists is out of Oregon. There's an Oregon evidence-based practice program that has a component for recognizing tribal best practices programs, and they have criteria that's very similar to what's in the guidance. So some of the criteria in Oregon include the longevity of the process, similar to the guidance, that there's a written description of the program, that it can be replicated in the community or elsewhere, that it's consistent with tribal principles, that there are measurable outcomes, and that the program can be implemented with fidelity to the model. So those are some of the criteria there, and using those criteria, they have approved 23 tribal best practices programs for funding under their evidence-based program. So that's, I think, an example that I think the Children's Bureau is likely to look at as they implement this, since many of the criteria they're talking about are somewhat similar. Now, for those tribes who are not coming in for direct funding, it does become a little more complicated, because those tribes are coming in through the state Title IV-E program, and so they have to be in part of that 4E prevention program. So that would include things like one of the challenges is that tribes and states working together to make sure that when states are submitting these programs, that where there are particular things that tribes might want to do, or if the tribal population is going to be targeted in some way, that be included in state plans. But in addition to that, the way in which the culturally, as indicated in the next slide, the way that the culturally adapted programs issue is going to be addressed for those tribes is not going to be quite the same, most likely. Again, some of this is still in development, so we don't know all of this for sure, but those tribes are not specifically covered in the guidance for the direct tribes. In the clearinghouse, which has been mentioned earlier, they do say that in the future they are going to address the availability of culturally specific or location or population-based adaptations of programs. So they clearly recognize the need to do something within the clearinghouse to address cultural programming. And obviously the statute itself also contemplates the use by tribes of this, but exactly how that's going to be played out through that process is unclear. We think that those tribes will have access to funding for some culturally adapted programs, but it may be narrower in scope for direct funded programs, so we'll have to wait and see. But I think one of the key strategies for all tribes, and including those coming to agreements, is a strategy where evidence-based programs are approved that are culturally based. And again, Family Spirit is probably the number one example I think that we all think about as a culturally based program that really ought to get approved for the purposes of Family Spirit. I know that some of our folks in another unit in Casey in our research department are working with the National Indian Child Welfare Association to try to get some studies done in terms of their positive Indian parenting program. So I think getting more programs that go through the rigorous process is certainly one way that tribes can be assured of having access to those programs, but hopefully there'll be additional flexibility for those tribes as well as we go forward. The next slide, please. Okay, so again, for tribes not currently accessing Title IV-E, and nationally, there are probably somewhere in excess of 200 tribes that do access 4E, but that's out of over 500 tribes nationally. So there are a lot of tribes who are not accessing 4E now. But in the 4E law, there's a provision that says that states must negotiate in good faith with tribes who want to operate 4E in regard to all or part of the program. And so now that Family First is part of the 4E program, it may be for some tribes that simply contracting to access Family First is a way to ease into the program in a way that really might be very consistent with their goals of keeping kids with their families and out of foster care. And the reason it may be easier is because, as most of you probably know, for the rest of the program, if you're going to get maintenance payments for foster care, for example, you have to go through an eligibility process that involves mostly an income eligibility process. If you're claiming for admin or training costs, you have to do time studies and cost allocation methodologies. It's much more complicated than would need to be the case to access these prevention dollars for programs that are covered by Family First. So it may be an opportunity for tribes. Now, the other thing that's, I think, also worth mentioning is the impact of the Family First legislation on Indian children in state systems. As many of you may know, the Indian Child Welfare Act is a federal law which governs how state systems must treat Indian children and families who get involved with the child welfare system. And one of the requirements in ICWA is that active efforts must be made to keep families together. And that's contrasted with reasonable efforts, which applies to all kids. And so that efforts requirement is generally considered to be a more stringent requirement. And one of the things that it talks about in order to meet active efforts is that the state must be partnering with the tribe, that they must be providing services consistent with the tribe's social and cultural standards. And so, we see Family First as a mechanism where states might be able to better comply with the active efforts requirement because of the additional resources which will come into the states particularly, but also we just want to throw out the idea that contracting with tribes may be another way to for states to meet that active efforts requirement. So I think that what we think about at Casey in terms of Family First is that it's a tool and it's an opportunity. It's not a panacea, but if we can all make use of these, if tribes and states can make use of these new tools, it will be a more effective way to protect children and families. So with that, I think on the next slide, you can see my contact information, and I'm happy to respond to any questions now, or if you think of something later, you can note my contact information and send me an email. So thank you again for the opportunity to present.
Thank you. Thank you all. And we do have questions. This has just been an interesting and presentation chock full of information. So I appreciate the participation from all of you. Marissa and Emily, you gave us a lot to think about when considering the cultural context for implementing or adapting effective programs for Indigenous populations. And Jack, your discussion around the challenges and opportunities present in funding and implementing and building evidence through Family First will go a long way toward helping us understand more about what's needed for culturally based practices. But now it's your turn, audience, because it's time for questions. And remember, you can enter questions in the Q&A window, and we'll just try to get to as many as we can. But I have some for our group that have come in as you've been speaking. And the first one is, Jack, you may have addressed a lot of this, but it's a very specific question about in reference to the selection process for Family First. Have any of you found particularly effective ways for child welfare systems or other public systems who are interested in a particular program, like Family Spirit, to have that program reviewed? I know there's a handbook that outlines the review processes, but have any of you found a particularly effective way to get a particular program reviewed?
Well, I'll take a shot at it, but I think maybe the Family Spirit folks might be able to join in as well. I know that there is upcoming, there's going to be an opportunity they're going to be out seeking public comments as to what programs should be reviewed next by the clearinghouse. And I think it would be very useful for folks to be weighing in for Family Spirit specifically to be in the next cohort of programs that are reviewed. Since it really is, I think, of all the culturally based programs out there, the one that has been recognized by in other forums as having met these kinds of criteria. So I don't know if you want to add anything. Anybody else wants to add something?
Okay, thanks, Jack. Yeah, I think that helps address, I think Emily had an earlier point about that as well in terms of, as it relates to Family Spirit. So this is a two-part question, and again, it's for any of the three of you. The first part is, how can programs that are addressing generational trauma connect with each other? And also as a part of that question, are there resources available where people can be trained to advocate to better serve those who are affected by trauma? We know of one in particular. We would start out by talking about the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. But how about the three of you? Does anybody have any advice for our listener?
Hi, this is Marissa. That's a great question. I think one way that we talk about it when we talk about family spirit, how it relates to family spirit, is when we looked at the slide of, just the major components of a program is the community referral piece. And so, it's one way to establish that partnership with the community. And we always say that, you cannot really implement a program, a community program like this successfully if you're not working with other partners in the community. So we know that, there's other organizations that, have different outcomes and objectives that they're looking to do with their community. But the biggest thing that we recommend is that you work with you establish what we call a community advisory board. And so that just allows you guys to come together and based on, what your goals are, and it could be focusing on trauma, how to address and combat trauma. That could be the goal of your meetings and talking about that. That's one way to look at it. The other way is, because the family spirit, we looked at some of the outcomes and how it reaches that early life stages of children, and even how parents can play into that. It doesn't, and it's not packaged to say this is a trauma-informed program, but when you really look at it, it is. It is because you're considering all the cultural components of what it means to be resilient and what it means to go back to the root of who you are as a person. And so a lot of the work that's being done looks at that, and it goes back to the very foundational teachings of programs and cultures and tribes. And so, that would just be my take on that piece.
Thank you, Marissa. Emily or Jack, do you want to weigh in on any of this? Okay. Marissa, while you're speaking, I have a question that's specifically for you. Could you explain a little bit more about the credentialing requirements for the paraprofessional family health educators?
Yeah, sure. So essentially what we do is we leave it to the program. So for Family Spirit, it's a fortunate thing where we do allow programs to be sovereign in that way. So it's really up to the program on who they identify as the health educator. So a lot of them are community health representatives, and then we even have social workers and some doctors that are also trained in Family Spirit. So they implement it in ways that fits their professional field. But there's nothing on our end to where, we require them to be at a certain level. So, and I think that is where it's really successful, because we know that it's a challenge to have those professional, per se, individuals implementing a program like this.
Marissa, does the curriculum include someone coming to the community and helping with implementation?
Yeah, so we do it. So the process is that it looks like we would do a contract with a potential affiliate, and then we would have our trainers actually train these health educators. I guess that's what maybe the question was about. I apologize if I didn't answer it directly, but that's what we would do. We would train up on that, and it's a very rich training schedule that we have, and so we touch on a lot of the preparing for implementation and after implementation as well, and the curriculum, of course.
Thank you, Marissa. Jack, here's one that I think might be for you, and I hope I'm interpreting this question correctly. You might have already touched on this, but are there any Title IV-E tribes that are planning to move forward with Family First in October of 2019? I think you talked about it a bit, but could you expand a bit?
Yeah, I know there are tribes that are working on plans to implement. Whether they'll be ready by October 1st, I think is still uncertain. I can tell you that at Casey Family Programs, we're convening a meeting of direct funded tribes in September to try to provide them with an opportunity to really focus on their plans for implementation and provide various technical assistance, hopefully, in that process. So we're certainly actively encouraging tribes to move forward, but I think it's probably safe to say some won't be ready by October, but I know of at least a few that are in the process of developing plans now, and I know they would like to start in October, but we'll see.
Great, thank you. That sounds really interesting. This one, let's see. How can this is probably for all three of you, how can the public get better resources to keep people from falling through the cracks due to lack of knowledge, resources, and or funding? And an example would be maybe how could a family get referred to the special services provided by Family Spirit if they're not connected with a community resource or a public child welfare system? Anybody want to take a crack at that one?
Well, I mean, I'll just say briefly, I mean, in terms of Family First, it's only one component of a broader system. And I think that's how that needs to be thought of, because Family First is targeted towards children who are at risk of foster care. And we know that there are families that don't meet that criteria, thankfully, but they still might benefit from some of these services. So I think a lot of it is a need for systems themselves to do a better job of integrating everything so that families indeed can access that. And I know there are places that have done that. I've seen systems that have done that effectively, but it's not, I have to say it's probably more the exception than the norm. So I know that doesn't answer your question directly, but maybe the other participants might have a more direct answer.
Emily or Marissa?
Yeah, well, I think it is. That's another good question, and I think I'm really happy to hear that people are thinking this way, because again, it is a problem. Like you said, families that are not affiliated with a program or not actually receiving services to where Family Spirit or any other program could come across their table. So I think one thing is maybe just getting more tribal support for implementing programs like this in the community. That's not federal, or that's not affiliated that way. I think that's the only thing. Otherwise, yeah, it is a big challenge, and we do recognize that. And then potentially, it's a big goal, but having funding for voluntary services like home visiting. We actually got a question from a potential or an interested affiliate wanting to know how they could train just community members and to implement that, to have them teach families, and so they wouldn't necessarily be employed with their organization, but just having them volunteer and teaching. And so we have things like that come across our table, but it's really it's just a matter of working with the site and seeing how feasible that is really. But yeah, I think that's kind of what we would respond.
Okay, great. I think we might have one more question. Do we have time for one more? All right, let's go with this one. So again, this is probably for Marissa and Emily. Can non-reservation or urban or rural Native populations be eligible for Family Spirit? If you don't live on a reservation, can you still access the services from Family Spirit?
Yeah, so Family Spirit is actually present in exactly those communities that you listed. and very much so. And they're actually a big chunk of our sites. We consider them affiliates. So yes, we're present in even in Oakland. Oakland's very urban. We have families that live out there in Boston and Baltimore. So yes, the answer is yes.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that's about it. We probably should go ahead and wrap up. Once again, thank you so much, Marissa and Emily and Jack, for your contribution. And thank you, everybody, for joining the webinar today, especially those who contributed to the question and answer discussion. On this last slide, you will find links to our previous webinars in the Leading with Evidence series. But I'd like to close by inviting you to our next webinar, which will discuss 3 key fiscal elements to consider when planning for funding of Family First Preservation Services. Those of you who've been following along with this series will remember that Margaret Flynn Kahn presented last year on some of the fiscal strategies around implementing programs for prevention services. She'll join us again this year with more information on tools and strategies for funding programs and services and interventions in child welfare systems, especially relevant given that there'll be a lot of groups applying in October and awards being given next year. Please remember that you'll get a recording of each webinar, including this one that we just presented, so that you should have the information that you'll need all in one place. Again, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of the afternoon.